I'm going to talk a lot about penguins. I hope you're not disappointed, and climate change and other aspects of biodiversity in Antarctica. This photo was taken at Cape Crozier. I'll talk a lot about this place called Cape Crozier. It's one of the largest Adelie penguin colonies in the world, and those are Adelie penguins there. They're about knee high. They are an animal that I've been studying very intensively for 23 years, yeah. And I did my PhD work with them quite some time ago now. So the thing about Antarctica, which I'm sure you've already touched on this in some way, I'm sorry I haven't seen the previous 7 lectures, so I hope I don't repeat myself too much, and if I'm getting into stuff that you've already covered well, please just say, we already heard, we know all this stuff. And that's totally fine. But I do want to mention the way Antarctica sort of functions as a natural laboratory. That's one of the reasons that I work there, is because of that concept. And a lot of other scientists work there. There's a very healthy National Science Foundation funded, and to some extent NASA and USGS funded, set of research programs that have been running in the Antarctic for a long time, since the 50s. And some of the time series go back a lot further than that, like the one you're looking at here, which is ice core data. And so a lot of the scientists and a lot of the equipment that's on the airplane that I'll be on in a couple weeks heading down to Antarctica actually is related to doing ice cores, because Antarctica is one of the best places in the world to do ice core work. And that's because it is very pristine, and it has been for a very long time. And the ice is very deep there. It's a couple miles deep in a lot of places. And that means that there's ice that was made going back 800,000 years, as in this case. And in fact, now some of the older ice cores are going back to 2.4 million years with new technology. And so there's an interesting mix of people who know how to do a drill rig, which is complicated going that deep, and pulling up ice, which is relatively fragile, and it has to come back up in the core completely intact and pristine so that it can be sectioned. And so these teams of people who work on that project have all kinds of people who know how to make drills work, know how to be very, very clean about handling specimens, and also people who know about how to do the various methods of extracting tiny bubbles of air that were deposited in that ice when that ice was made. So the neat thing to be thinking about is that there's air pockets in the ice that are 800,000 years old and now 2.5 million years old. And so we can look at the properties of those air bubbles and understand what the composition of the Earth's atmosphere was at different times through history. And that gives us this really good idea of what was going on with atmospheric greenhouse gases, and we can figure out what the Earth's temperature was in coinciding with that. And obviously one of the most important takeaway messages from this slide is that we live in this, all of human civilization has existed in this little part, the Holocene, the last 10,000 years.
Relative to the past 800,000 years, it's a pretty special time, although there has been times previously when we were in this range of carbon dioxide. But now, and there's a trick question coming here. I'm going to ask you what's wrong with this figure. But now, obviously, we've exceeded by a long way the historic carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere. Does anyone know, okay, first of all, what's wrong with the figure?
Inaccurate.
In what way?
It's not high enough.
It's not high enough, right? We're over 400 now, that's right. We passed 400 in 2013, so this slide is old. That's good. Not good that we're over 400, but we're at 410 or so globally. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, does anyone know when the last time the Earth's atmosphere was above 400 parts per million carbon dioxide? Any idea?
Never.
250 million years ago.
No, not quite that long ago, but that's a good guess. I mean, it did come and go through that time. You're probably right. It was probably, I mean, there probably was a time back then too. But the last time that we think it was that high was about 4 million years ago. So human species, we think, is about 200,000 years, more or less recognizable as us. Obviously, civilization is more like 10,000 years. So in the scheme of things, we're in a very, very unusual time. And this is one of the key messages that we just have to keep remembering. It's very hard to kind of comprehend these kinds of time scales, obviously. But that's one of the key things to know about what's going on with our Earth's atmosphere. And as a scientist, I feel both daunted and scared and worried, but also very excited about the opportunity, because I mean, this is a completely bizarre time to be alive and to be observing our Earth. So we're going to talk a lot about ice today. Have you talked a lot about ice already? Different kinds of ice? A little bit about different kinds of ice. Okay, so this is a picture taken out the window of a military transport plane on its way from New Zealand to Antarctica, and it's in the Ross Sea. And we're flying along what's called the Victoria Land coast, and coming up on a place called Terra Nova Bay. And in the picture, there's several kinds of ice. So I chose this picture because of that. So in sort of the foreground, this is called pack ice. This is frozen ocean that is broken up a bit. So there's some open water, some leads in the open water in the pack ice. And this is really good habitat for a lot of the species that you think of as Antarctic biology. So Adelie penguins, emperor penguins, Weddell seals, minke whales, killer whales. Love this kind of habitat. Then you get into some of this over here. This is called fast ice. Now fast ice is also frozen ocean. So salt water, all of this is salt water. Fast ice is frozen ocean that is attached to land or to glaciers. And that's habitat for emperor penguins, which nest on it, and also Weddell seals, which have their colonies on the fast ice. So that's a very dangerous place to have as your home, as the only place that you can live these days, because it's disappearing pretty fast. And then you have these things, glaciers and ice tongues. And glaciers are freshwater. And so when we talk about the effect of melting glaciers on sea level rise, it's this kind of stuff that matters. And the changes in that are affecting sea level. So frozen ocean is salty. This is all freshwater. This stuff doesn't matter at all in terms of sea level rise. It is in the ocean already, and it's just whether it's frozen or not frozen. And just another thing about sea ice. This is a really good picture of what's called a polynya, or an open area of water in the ice. And these polynyas occur throughout anywhere there's sea ice. You also have some openings in sea ice, usually driven by wind. This is a very windy place, and you can see the wind on the water, and it's actually forming ice. And this water is -2 degrees Celsius, and there's very, very cold, very fast wind blowing across the surface. And it's creating ice in kind of a conveyor belt. And the ice gets denser and denser as it gets further away from the wind, and it's pushing it out. So every year in the wintertime, or in the fall and winter, this ice conveyor belt gets going. And that wind pushes the water away from the shore, and it freezes, and the ice gets further and further out to a point, and new ice forms behind it. and that you need that wind to keep opening up the water. If the wind stops, then everything just freezes over and you get fast ice. So the Arctic and the Antarctic are completely different systems in a lot of ways. They're both part of the cryosphere, the frozen part of our planet, but the Arctic is oceanic and the Antarctic is mostly continental. So at the North Pole you have ocean, open ocean, and you have an ice cap that's almost entirely frozen ocean, sea ice. And when we talk about changes in the Arctic, we're talking about changes in sea ice largely, unless you're talking about Greenland. With Greenland over here, it also has major glaciers on it. So that's the other major glaciated place on the Earth aside from Antarctica. So all this is sea ice back in 1984. And thanks, Tom, for sharing these slides. These are good. And it shows not just how much sea ice there was, but also the ages of the sea ice. And the age of the sea ice is important because every year, some of the sea ice from the previous year does not melt and it sticks around, depending on how warm it gets, right? And how much wind there is and that sort of thing. So this is old ice. This white stuff is the older ice. And then the grayer stuff is new ice. So there's new ice that's made every year, and then there's old ice that sticks around. And so there's a couple things going on here. And you look at 2016, not only is there a lot less ice, for example, in this part of the Arctic, see the big change there, but also it's almost all new ice. There's almost no old ice. So that means it's melting out every summer. So that obviously has major consequences to ecosystems. You can imagine any animals that depend on sea ice for a living are having some problems. Does anybody name one in the Arctic? Exactly, that's the iconic. And sometimes I show a slide of a polar bear with some penguins and I go, what's wrong with this picture? But yeah.
Where did you get the polar bears with the...
I did some photoshopping, yeah. It's a pretty convincing Photoshop. Everyone's like, I don't know. Yeah, there's no penguins in the Arctic because the polar bears ate them all, but no, I'm just kidding. So yeah, polar bears, walruses are having some problems. There's different kinds of seals, harp seals. So that's the change you see through time. Since we've been able to record the amount of sea ice anywhere on Earth, it's basically from satellites. So 1979 was when we first were able to use satellite imagery to quantify how much sea ice was over the entire Arctic and the Antarctic. And it's been declining pretty rapidly, and it's very alarming. Switching over to glaciers, the data on the Greenland ice sheets is equally, if not more, alarming. This is a contribution to sea level. This kind of melting will contribute to sea level. This is measured also from satellites, and we can actually detect this sort of it's both through altimetry, so understanding where the surface of the ice is and how that's changing through time, but also the mass of the Earth is actually changing, and the distribution of the mass of the Earth changes, and there are satellites that can actually detect that. And there's enough ice melt that you can actually measure how the center of gravity of the Earth is moving as the ice sheets melt, which is pretty amazing physics. And so then if you look at the sea ice situation, the Arctic has this decline through time. The Antarctic actually shows a slight increasing trend, and we'll get into why that is. And then overall combined, there's a slight decrease. Now this kind of hides some very important details. It doesn't look quite as bad, unfortunately, as it actually is. But note this right here, right? This drop in 2017, very, very disturbing. So we're right in the middle of something. We don't know if that was, it was extremely anomalous last year in the Antarctic, basically everywhere in the Antarctic. So one of the things I'm eager to see is what's going on this year with all the animals that live down there. How did that affect them? Because it really stands out as a major change. And hopefully not, the tipping point kind of change, but that's definitely coming up as a possibility. So this is some work by a colleague of mine, Susan Stammerjohn, who came up with this concept in collaboration with some folks at NASA about the sea ice season, which is a great way to think about it from an ecological perspective, thinking about the period of time during which the sea ice is growing and expanding versus shrinking. And that period of expansion is normally winter, peaking in September or October. And the period of decline is usually beginning in December and then extending into March, February, March. So that period of time, you can think of it like the sort of spring arrival time, spring into summer for all the migratory birds that we have here. And that season being the breeding season. So the period of, imagine a change in our summers here, ecologically thinking about that, of 90 days shorter, 90 days less summer, or 90 days less winter for that matter. That is a massive ecological change over a very short amount of time. This is only in the last 40 years. So we have the Arctic, which we talked about. Now I'm going to separate the Antarctic Peninsula region from the Ross Sea and also East Antarctica in general. And we'll talk a lot about the Ross Sea today. But the Antarctic Peninsula is doing exactly what the Arctic is doing. Basically, we're losing sea ice very fast there. And the Antarctic Peninsula is just south of South America. It's the most northerly part of Antarctica, and it's most in contact with major ocean current circulation. And it is definitely making a lot less sea ice. And sea ice is disappearing. The Ross Sea, opposite pattern. It has been a period of growth in sea ice, which has a lot of people scratching their heads and a lot of climate deniers going, see, it's just balancing out. It's actually not actually balancing out. You saw that there was an overall negative trend in that previous slide. But that's what they point at, and they say, well, you're just cherry picking the data if you look at, you call it decreasing radically. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Ross Sea, remember, is the farthest south you can go and still have ocean anywhere on Earth. It's the coldest place on Earth. So we've also talked, we've heard about massive breakups of large glaciers. The Larsen B is that blue one, Larsen C is the yellow one, and the Ross ice shelf is the red one. The Larsen B broke up very quickly, lost a huge piece of it many years ago now. It's been like 10 years or something like that. But it broke so fast that it caught everybody by surprise. It kind of shattered. And what we realized subsequently was that there were cracks that had formed and meltwater getting into the cracks, going very far back into the glacier, and that hadn't been detected. They're very hard to detect from satellites. And so those cracks all of a sudden created this huge sort of shattering effect, and we lost a big piece of it. We also lost a big chunk of the Ross ice shelf in 2001 when this massive iceberg broke off called B15, and we'll talk more about B15 in a little while. But these things break off, and then the Larsen C was more recent. That was just last year. I think we have more on that. There's a crack that formed, and that one was visible from space, and people were watching it for a while. And that's basically where it was as of January 2017, and then very quickly we lost the rest of it. So only a matter of 5 or 6 months later, that piece broke off, and that was the size of, I guess, Wales. But also, I think Delaware is another comparison. People talk about Delaware and Rhode Island as iceberg sizes, but that's about the size of that piece. So these things break off faster now than they used to, we think. And why is that? This image, which is in some ways, amazingly beautiful, especially for people who love Antarctica like I do. It's a map that shows all of the ice streams and the rate of movement of those ice streams, and this is like reflecting an amazing amount of geophysics and other kinds of work.
Explain what we're seeing here.
So we are seeing basically the basins and the glaciers on Antarctica. So the brighter colors are where the ice is moving the fastest. Bluer is not moving very much, and then you have basically not very much ice movement in here. So you have these streams, and it's normal for this ice to be moving. It's been moving forever. It builds up in mass and it pushes out into the ocean, but they're moving faster and faster. And so what recently this year, about 4 months ago, there was a pretty major study that came out that basically revealed that these things are moving at least 3 times faster than we thought previously. And basically what that means is that they're contributing to sea level rise a lot faster than our sea level rise models currently account for. So we recently established sort of a base of like accepting that there's going to be, whatever it was something like 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100 at the high end. That didn't account for the fact that these glaciers are actually moving way faster than we thought. So we're going to be redoing all the sea level rise projections again. But basically, we're starting to get better and better information about this. Again, also measured independently by those satellites that can measure where the center of gravity of the Earth is, and measuring the mass of the Antarctic ice sheets. And it's changed. It's in some crazy number of trillions and trillions of tons lighter than was projected. So that's sort of the baseline, the context of sort of large scale, what's going on with sea ice, what's going on with ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the research that I've personally been involved with for a while. And you can learn more about it at the website penguinscience.com. But we came into this from kind of like a classic ecological perspective, and this goes back to Malthus, in the 1780s or whenever he was writing his work. Basically, why do animals live where they live? And the problem with trying to understand this is that humans, of course, have basically changed everything about the Earth and the natural systems. So it's very hard to get a clear picture. Understanding how humans have affected things, and humans have been affecting things for more than 10,000 years. It's not just in recent times. It's been going on for a while, but obviously recently bigger changes. And so Antarctica and the Ross Sea in particular, and the Ross Sea is that place that I showed you where the ice is actually getting bigger. There's more ice, more sea ice. We think of it as close as we can come in ecology and in oceanography to this concept that Aldo Leopold talked about as a base datum for normality. Basically, a place where all the parts are still there. All the animals are still there, the interactions are still there, the physical systems are still working the way they've been working for a very, very long time. And this is to also try to avoid, in conservation biology, which is my main field, this problem of the shifting baseline, where every generation of humans comes along and basically kind of accepts that the way things are in their existence is the way they've always been. And so through that process, we basically allow for a certain amount of degradation. There's a decay. And it's very difficult to convince people that the stories that their grandparents were telling or their great-great-grandparents were telling were true. And very few people have great notes on anything. And of course, before about 1950 or so, there weren't a lot of photographs of things. There were a few, but not a lot. Before 1979, we didn't have these satellite images of the planet. So we don't have you don't have great vision going back. You have to rely on things like that ice core data, which is amazing, but it's a proxy. Other things like tree ring data or sediment cores from all over the place. You kind of have to put it all together to kind of imagine it. And it takes a lot of patience and a lot of sort of faith in science and the scientific process, which a lot of people don't have so much. So it's a major concern. And we have to do what we can to sort of establish sort of these baselines that people will understand and use to steward the planet effectively. So I'm going to go through a few slides of just sort of how this works, because everyone always asks, how do we get to Antarctica? We fly in that airplane. It's a C-130. It was built in 1952. Every part on it has been replaced, so they tell me. Inside, the C-130 is not a very comfortable ride. You're basically interlocking knees with the person next to you or in front of you. And there's a huge amount of cargo on these planes as well. It's not a fun ride. You see everyone's wearing ear protection. It's very loud in there. It smells terrible. Not because of the people, but because of the diesel exhaust or the jet fuel exhaust that's going through there. It's just a nasty experience. A lot of people don't do it again after they do it once. And you end up turning around and going all the way back. So it'll fly down to Antarctica and decide we're not landing, and it'll go back to New Zealand, and you try again the next day. So that's not very much fun. But you get there and you get to land, and that's a C-17. So if you're lucky, you get to ride on a C-17, which is much faster. It takes about 9 hours on the C-130 with skis, so it lands on the sea ice. During early season and early in the season when it's still cold enough, you can land a C-17 on the ice, and that's a lot faster. But that's what it looks like when you land there.
Are those people or penguins on the sides?
Those are, I think those are pylons marking the runway. Good question, though. Not penguins. And then when you first get there, they put you through a sort of a crash course on how to not kill yourself in Antarctica. So they say, okay, you're going to spend 24 hours out in learning survival skills with some people who really know what they're talking about. And the guides are coming from all over the world, mountaineers who guide Everest and Denali and things like that. And this is what they do for fun. In the off seasons, they come down and make fun of us, teach us how to do things like this is called a quinsy, which is you basically take all the gear you have, make a big pile out of it, and then pound the snow and like stop the snow. And the snow in Antarctica is so dry that it doesn't like to stick to itself. It's really kind of like sand. So you have to really pack it, and then you dig in and pull your gear out, and then you've got something like an igloo. It works pretty well. It's not that warm in there, but it's out of the wind at least. That thing behind it is a Scott tent, which is a lot easier. It's literally the same technology that Robert Falcon Scott was using at the turn of the century when he went down there.
Scott didn't survive.
And he died. He actually died in that tent right there. So, he died in a tent very much like that one. Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. But he died because he ran out of food, not because he was cold. And that's our camp at Cape Crozier. So the first slide I showed you was at Cape Crozier with the penguin colony. This is above the penguin colony, about 1 kilometer, where we have our hut out of the way of the penguins. The penguins do sometimes come up and visit, but not usually. And we actually sleep in the Scott tents because the hut is so small. It's only about 16 feet long and 8 feet wide, made out of plywood. It is insulated and it's got a heater, so it's warm and it's safe from the wind. But it's pretty small, and there's only, I'll come to you in a sec. There's only about, there's about 6 people living in there sometimes. So it's a little too tight. And it smells bad because we were cooking in there, and there's like, propane exhaust and stuff like that. Not to mention we don't have a shower, so people start smelling pretty bad after they've been working with the penguins all summer. So we sleep in our tents, and we have a little privacy, and it's not warm in the tents, it's warm in your sleeping bag in the tent. So you don't hang out in the tent, you hang out in your sleeping bag in your tent. You have a question?
Approximately what is the temperature?
When we start, so my team is actually there now, and it's minus 25 Fahrenheit now. It will be, when I get there in a couple of weeks, it'll go down to minus 15 or something like that. And then it goes, I'm staying in Fahrenheit now, it'll be between 0 and 32 basically through December. It could even get up to 8 or 9 degrees above in a couple of days, like for a few days. Yeah. It's pretty warm. There's actually 24 hours of sunlight too, which makes it a lot. It doesn't feel as bad as it sounds. You feel like, when you have that much sunlight and it's such a beautiful place, you kind of have this optimism. The problem is when the wind comes, and I have a video I'll show you in a second. So that's what it looks like inside the tent. So you can see we're, we got, trying to get all our laptops on a tiny table, and people are sitting up on a bunk, and got a bunch of gear in there. It's just not comfortable for sleeping. But if we have to, we do sleep in there. And then we're supported by helicopter from a place called McMurdo Station. That's where that airplane was landing. It's about 60 miles from our camp to there. So we fly out in a helicopter. And everything that we bring with us and everything that we produce, all of our human waste, all of our garbage, gets flown out of there. This place is a very, very specially protected area. It's very highly permitted. We have to do a bunch of training just to be able to be there. And every year it gets looked at and reviewed again. So there's only about probably 10 people in the world that have a permit to go there. If you want to do science there, you have to go through that whole process in order to. And some of the things they teach you is how to connect your urine barrels to a helicopter so they can take it away. You actually have to do that. So it's a good adventure. Okay, let's try this video. This is one storm that gives you a sense of what it can be like. So this is after the wind calmed down a bit, and the tent the tent was already pretty messed up, obviously. So we're trying to get somebody's sleeping equipment out of the tent so they can use it inside the hut. So the problem is the wind, basically, when it's doing that, it can pick up little pebbles and grit and get in your eyes. It shreds tents. These are mountain tents. They're not those Scott tents. The Scott tents actually hold up really well. These mountain tents are, they're four-season mountaineering tents, the same kind you would use on Everest or in Denali. They hold up to about 85 miles an hour, and then they start getting destroyed at that point. Turn down the volume on this video. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Okay.
They have replacement tents there?
Yeah. There's a lot of yes. There's this great place called the Berg Field Center in McMurdo Station. It's basically like an REI, and you can walk in there and grab whatever you want, and they don't charge you anything, and you can just, you can walk out of there with like 5 tents if you want, which is fantastic. They have an amazing storehouse of tents. Yeah. Yes.
Where do they get their electricity?
We make all of our electricity with solar.
Oh.
Yeah. So this is the Ross Sea. That's the area that I've been working in, south of New Zealand. It's the opposite side of Antarctica from where most people go. And again, so this is a satellite image that shows that area that was highlighted in the orange square before. Let me go back to that. So I'm going to zoom in there and talk a little bit about ice again. So, okay, so this whole area is the Ross Sea. And then this is a very large polynya called the Ross Sea polynya, and it's a very, very important feature of the Earth, actually. It's at a global scale. It does all kinds of interesting things, including supporting a very large number of animals that exist all around the edges of it, primarily. This ice is that pack ice I was talking about earlier, and there's a lot of pack ice here, and that pack ice allows diatoms to flourish. So the diatoms actually grow on the ice. It's kind of like a substance that it can attach to. And then the diatoms are grazed by krill and copepods, and to some extent fish, and then which are in turn eaten by basically everything. So it's a very simple food web. There's not a lot of species here compared to California or to the tropics, where you could have, on the Farallon Islands alone, we have had 400 different species of birds. In Antarctica, my bird list is about 8. So it's a really different situation, totally different kind of ecosystem. But there's millions and millions of animals. So it's a huge biomass, but relatively species poor. Then you have these glaciers. This is actually the area that I was showing you from the airplane, the Terra Nova Bay polynya. This is the Ross Ice Shelf that we talked about, one of those glaciers that's moving much faster than everyone thought. Let's see, where's my mouse? There it is. Okay, this area over here is where we landed on the airplane at McMurdo, and this is Cape Crozier over here at this end of the island. All this out farther is dense pack ice, basically. Let me see if I have a date on this. I think this was in October or something. I don't have the date. Okay, so then there was this study that came out in 2012 or something like that by a guy named Mark Halpern and some colleagues. And he basically he came up with an index of ocean health globally, totally independent of anything we were doing. And that, it was generally depressing. The Earth is, pretty degraded. And in fact, more than half of the Earth's surface has had significant alteration, both the ocean and land. But the good news was there's large parts of the Arctic and Antarctic that were relatively pristine still. And from our perspective, it was really interesting that they actually identified the Ross Sea as the least affected by humans of anywhere on Earth. And that's good news for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is, that polynya that I was talking about is related to generating this incredible carbon sink that's just this kind of amazing natural sequesterer of carbon. And that's because it actually manages to go through 2 full blooms of diatoms and algae every year. And that algae, those diatoms, go largely ungrazed. So, and that's kind of an interesting situation. So the idea that there's a surplus of diatoms anywhere in the world is kind of like mind-blowing, because that just doesn't happen. And what we think is going on is that the diatoms are basically not fully utilized by krill because the krill are getting eaten by so many other animals. And we'll come back to that idea. But what's interesting to note is that this is, for the entire Southern Ocean, this is this little piece of the Southern Ocean. So everything south of 60 degrees south, this little part of it is sequestering 28% of all, it's 28% of all this carbon sequestration that's happening in the Southern Ocean. And it's about the equivalent of 10 million cars a year off the road. How many cars in California?
One for each.
There's 32 million cars in California right now, just to put that in perspective. Okay, so the food web looks a bit like this, pretty basic. We have these krill, in this case it's crystal krill, which are slightly smaller than the krill that are out here in the Pacific, also than Antarctic krill, which are talked a lot about. Crystal krill are more closely associated with sea ice than other types of krill. And there's this thing called the Antarctic silverfish, which is sort of like an anchovy. And this is what penguins really like to eat in our area, but basically everything else likes to eat them too. They even eat each other, actually. They're kind of crazy. And Weddell seals, again, totally dependent on fast ice for making their colonies and raising their young every year. And they have this crazy life cycle, which relies on them being able to chew their way through ice to create a hole and maintain a hole, and maintain an open access to the water so that they can feed. And they also build up so much food that they can haul out for a couple of months, the mothers can, and wean a pup in a matter of about 3 months. And those pups, it's crazy because the pups, in this case, this is a good example actually of a pup that's getting to be almost as heavy as the mom. By the time the pup leaves, the pup is actually bigger than the mom. And she has a very intense situation at that point because she has to get fueled up pretty fast to prepare for winter. Emperor penguins also completely dependent on fast ice. Probably the craziest bird on Earth. Never has to touch land because they nest on ice. And very, very deep diving to 800 meters at least. And they start breeding in the middle of the winter, in July, in Antarctica when it's minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, for some reason. They figured out how to do that. It's pretty impressive. And then we have a special minke whale there that actually can break through the ice as well. And a lot of other species seem to follow the minke whales around because the minke whales make breathing holes in the fast ice, in relatively young fast ice and in the pack ice. And they eat a lot of krill and silverfish. A relatively small baleen whale. And we have a special killer whale too, the Ross Sea killer whale or type C killer whale. These killer whales have been recently described as individual species. So there used to be we always thought there was one killer whale on Earth, and now there's something like 7 or 8 species. This oblique eye patch is one of the ways you can tell this is a type C killer whale. It's not the greatest picture, although it is an amazing picture because it was taken underwater with killer whales. But there's a bunch of other killer whales here looking at this one, sort of wondering what it's going to do with this large fish that it has in its mouth. And we believe that they are cooperative feeders. We know that they do that in other parts of their range. So we think that there's a lot of learned behavior around how to catch these fish. The thing about toothfish is that they're incredibly large, and they have antifreeze for blood. So they've been studied for a really long time because we're trying to figure out what that protein is that they have in their blood that makes them able to survive in minus 2 degrees Celsius water. And there's been a study going back a long way of these fish. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But just one thing to know about toothfish is that they are now getting fished, and they're fished and sold here as toothfish or as Chilean sea bass. So next time you see any Chilean sea bass, by the end of the talk, hopefully you'll be boycotting that.
What do the toothfish eat?
The toothfish eat silverfish mostly, yeah. And then Adelie penguins. So we're gonna hone in on Adelies now. And Adelies are very numerous in the Ross Sea. About almost 40% of the whole population on Earth is there. And they eat a lot of silverfish and krill. So we'll do another video now. So this will give you an idea of the sort of the nature of Adelies and of Cape Crozier. So they're walking across fast ice, and they, depending on the year, they might have to cross, 50 kilometers of fast ice to get in, even 100 kilometers of fast ice. That doesn't take them very long, actually. It's pretty easy, and they'll scoot along pretty good. They'll toboggan like that if they want. And they're consummate navigators. They, being so short, they have to be able to find their way through this ice, and that sea ice, that rough stuff out there, is really hard to navigate through because they can't see over it. So they're using the sun and probably the Earth's magnetic fields, but we don't know for sure that they can do that. And then they follow each other around a lot. That's the shortcut, although sometimes that's not a good idea. So it is one of the windier places, and Antarctica is getting windier as a consequence, partly due to global warming. So a warmer troposphere basically makes it windier. There's more energy, but also thinning atmosphere. At the poles, we still have ozone holes. They're smaller than they were, but they're still there, and that thinner ozone at the poles sets up a kind of a situation where you have a warming lower atmosphere and a very cold upper atmosphere. And that difference in temperatures sets up really strong katabatic winds. So you get this cold air forming high elevation, high altitude, sinking, and rushing down into the warmer troposphere. And that's basically what does this. And these winds can get up to 200 miles an hour at least. The worst I've personally seen was about 151 miles an hour, but then the anemometer broke and actually blew away. So I don't know how bad it got, but that storm ended up being pretty significant for the penguins. But generally, they manage to pull through. They just kind of shake it off, and they're actually maybe too well adapted to dealing with this because they never abandon their nests. They'll stay on there, and in fact even die on the nest if they get buried. Indicating to me at least that they probably haven't had to deal with that situation very often in their life, because if it killed them, they'd not be here, or they would have learned how to abandon. Stones are fun. They need the stones to keep their eggs out of the water and out of the ice. Yeah?
How much do they weigh?
They weigh about 12 pounds. Yeah, 4 kilograms, 4 to 5 kilograms. Kind of like a big cat, house cat. Yeah, so this is what it's like when they're building the nest. Okay, I'm gonna leave it at that for now. Okay, we've done a lot of different kinds of studies with the Adelies, and they're actually one of the most well-studied animals on Earth. And that's sort of counterintuitive because they live in a place that's hard to get to, but they're actually very cooperative. They're very tame. They have no fear of humans whatsoever. So you can walk up to them, pick them up, and attach things like a GLS tag to them. So that then tracks them for an entire year. And we can learn things like where do they go in the wintertime. So this is some of the data that we've collected. Again, there's Cape Crozier down there in a corner, and this is the Ross Ice Shelf here. And the Ross Sea in the wintertime, just a little bit of a polynya even in the middle of winter. And the penguins are way out. These are all different penguins, all out pretty far away from Cape Crozier. This is a big migration. This is actually much longer migration than would be predicted for a bird that can't fly. The longest one we tracked went a round trip of 18,000 kilometers. And what they're doing, the color is two different colony sources. So The gold ones are from Cape Crozier, and the blue ones are from another colony at Cape Royds on the other side of the island. And one of the mysteries is, why is Cape Crozier huge and still growing, and Cape Royds is small and not growing? And one of the things that's different about them is that they winter in different areas. There's also this, the first time you go to Cape Crozier, almost everyone comments within the first 5 minutes they're there about all the dead penguins, all the penguin mummies, we call them. And there are thousands of these all over the colony. They're called subfossils. They're not quite fossilized, but they've been there for a while. And we thought, we asked some people who study these kinds of things how long they'd been there, and it's about 700 years. And most of them seem to be from basically one event. So we were wondering what could have caused that. And eventually, I think we have our answer. There's two hypotheses that went forward. One, remember the giant iceberg I was telling you about that broke off of the Ross Ice Shelf? This is like what happened to the Larsen Sea, but this happened to the Ross Ice Shelf in 2001. And this iceberg was 90 miles long, and it came along and it sat right in the middle of our penguin colony's foraging area where they go to get their food. And so we thought something like that might cause massive die-off of chicks, and that could be why there's all those mummies. Maybe that happened before. So when that happened, we were really worried that there would be no penguins at Cape Crozier, or that the adults would find their way in and then try to raise young and then be unsuccessful because they couldn't get out to the water. And it turned out that the biggest effect of B15 was actually, well, the first year, Cape Crozier did have a major problem, but the penguins didn't even try to breed that year. It took them a long time to figure out how to get around the iceberg and deal with it. But they learned it in a year, and by the second year, they were just going around it and finding food, and they were very successful, actually. But see all this fast ice? That wasn't there before B15 came along. So B15 changed the oceanography, or was associated with a shift in oceanography that resulted in some very, very anomalous fast ice situations where you had all of a sudden 120 miles of fast ice between Cape Royds and the open water. And that was not good for those penguins. So penguins that breed at Cape Royds, Cape Bird, had a very, very long walk all of a sudden. They were completely unsuccessful for many years at raising young.
Hey, Grant, can we find a place where we can?
Yeah. Yep. Next hypothesis about all the penguin mummies is massive snowfall events, which are becoming more common. And there's actually a paper recently about this, about how that has happened through time at different times by looking at these penguin mummies all over Antarctica. And a really cool paper actually showing how this does happen periodically. It's happening more often than it used to. And that's, again, with a warmer troposphere, you have more precipitation. And it's still snow on Ross Island, because Ross Island is at 77 degrees south. It's very cold there still. In other parts of Antarctica, it's raining, which is terrible for Adelie penguins. They don't like rain at all. They're not adapted to rain, cold rain. So the chicks get all wet. You can see they're kind of sort of slicked down, and that is not good for their insulation. In this case, this one storm, and this was in about 2004 or 5. I have a note here, 2004. One snowfall buried the entire colony. And luckily, it was only a few inches over their heads, and they were mostly able to poke through. But we actually felt compelled to go around and actually dig them out. Like, it was that bad. And we don't normally get involved. And it's like, there's no way we could actually do it for all the penguins. I mean, there's 600,000 penguins to deal with. But we did make an effort to sort of scrape some holes in some of the deeper areas. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at one last concept. So 2 slides, and then we'll take a break. So it's important to understand about Adelies is that their distribution around Antarctica is mostly in small colonies, smaller than 1,000 pairs of colonies. This is number of colonies all around Antarctica, and the size of the colonies, number of pairs. So most of them are less than 1,000 pairs, and there's only a few that are these really large ones, like Cape Crozier, greater than 100,000. So this is one of those key questions, like, well, why is that? And so Antarctica it does not have a lot of terrain for Adelies to nest on. That's the first problem. And the places where they need an open beach and access to open water. They don't nest on ice. They need there to be sort of gravel and sand. There aren't very many places like that in Antarctica, although there more and more are opening up with global warming and the retreat of glaciers. So that could be good for adelies in some ways. The other thing that's to look at is the pattern of penguin population growth through time. So over the period, this is actually from 1979 to 1999, but the same pattern holds true today. Where you've had massive retreat of sea ice or loss of sea ice, the penguin populations are disappearing. But where you have increase in the Ross Sea and in East Antarctica of sea ice, the penguin populations are increasing. So the fate of the penguins does seem to be linked to the sea ice. And that's probably largely to due to the food web that is associated with the sea ice. Okay, let's take a break and we'll come back in 15 minutes.